record.
Oh, yeah, you're gonna have to record it. I'm not allowed to because
Okay.
it's
What I'll do is
it's you
I
the
can send you the
you're
clip.
the host.
Okay. What I can,
Sure,
I'll just
you
email
can
you.
just send me the sound. Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Perfect. So if you're ready, I'll go when you're
I
when.
am.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for an episode of what we're going to be calling the Azorean Refugee Act, along with Professor Diniz Borges, who is the director of the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute. So, Professor Borges, thank you again for joining us for today. You know, I've seen a lot of uh, content on social media after the DACA Act after the Supreme Court struck down its recent activity. And I saw a lot of misinformation going around, and I'm constantly commenting more now than ever on social media, trying to inform people. And recently, through the radio show and the Politics and Pizza that I do, I've dedicated it to educating and informing the public now. And I thought, given our Portuguese background, a lot of individuals that I know aren't too familiar about the Azorean Refugee Act. And I was like, you know what, let me try and put together maybe an interview, a podcast of some sort to maybe, educate and inform people about what this was, what it did. And so I initially thought of you right away, given the work you've done. One, I absolutely love following you on social media. And if anyone is interested in following Portuguese uh, history or language, anything involving Portugal and the Azores, Madeira, follow Denise Borges. I mean, it's education. It's just like going to class, really, through your page. So,
No,
uh,
let's not bore him. Let's not bore him with class.
absolutely not. And I want to say in the beginning too, because I had a few comments. Yes, this is a mustache quarantine.
I was I was gonna ask. I was actually gonna congratulate you on a mustache because that's impressive.
Well, thank you, Professor Borges. Thank you again for this. So, if we wanted, because I think initially how we said we wanted to do this was discuss the Azorean Refugee Act, the Family Unification Act, and kind of how it influenced the Portuguese presence in America. So, to start, could you tell us a little bit about what was the Azorean Refugee Act? Take us from its conception to what it actually did in the United States.
Well, I think that the Azorian Refugee Act, without getting into the nuts and bolts of it, and I'm not a specialist on immigration history, so let me first of all say that that's not my specialty, if I have any specialty whatsoever. But uh, in the context that you mentioned, and you mentioned, some of the things, of course, since the DACA and some of the issues that are going on in immigration. And sometimes, Paul, we think that immigration and the way people are looking, whether it be at DACA or whether it be at immigrants from different parts of the world, the Muslim ban and all these kind of things that have happened in the last 3 years, but even prior to the last 3.5, 4 years. The United States, for a country of immigrants, has always had our history has always been very ambivalent when it comes to immigrants. I mean, immigrants have been at the forefront of discrimination for generations. Were the Irish and the Italians, and the Portuguese and the Mexicans and the Muslims, the Asians, etc. And so, obviously, some people blend in what we might call America more than others, and so others stand out a little bit more because of the way we perceive things, obviously wrongly. But it's an ongoing debate that we have in the United States, and I don't think there has ever been an immigrant group that has not had some sort of discrimination, especially in the beginning of its inception to the United States. The Azorian Refugee Act, and I do like to use it. There's a lot of people that don't like that term, but that's the true story. That's the true meaning of the law, and that is actually what it's called. I'm actually looking at it right here. It's included in an excellent book, which I'd like to send to you, and your viewers can also get it. It's called Capelinhos, a Volcano of Synergies, which is Azorian Immigration to America. It was coordinated by my friend Tony Goulart. It was published by Portuguese Heritage Publication of California. It's a large book. It's a coffee table book. Let me just show it. Oh, well, you can't see it the way I have my background, but it's, yeah, just remember that. But it's a large book, and so it's and it has some really interesting articles, essays on the whole act itself. But a lot of people just call it, oh, when the Azoreans were allowed to come to the United States, it was called a refugee act, just like any other refugees. If you come from Syria or you come from the Azores, a refugee is a refugee. Ours wasn't because, and thank God, it wasn't because of a war-torn country. It was because of a Mother Nature. It was because of a volcano. The first, it was the brainchild of two senators from two states in your area, Rhode Island and Massachusetts, the then young John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and also Senator Pastori from Rhode Island. And so both of them, and it is most historians that have done any research on this are pretty much in agreement. Both of the Azorean Refugee Act came because of the connections that both senators had to the Portuguese American community of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. We have been in both of those states for longer than the Azorean Refugee Act, obviously, but it was an older immigration. And so the repercussions on today's America, Portuguese America story are tremendous. So originally it was to allow 1,500 visas, okay? To people in that area. They were to be issued right after the volcano. Of course, the act went through right after the volcano, and they were to be used up until 1960. Eventually, another 500 were issued. Okay, so and then there was an extension of that. There are some conflicting stories. Some people say 4,000, some people say 5,000. Okay, but one way or another, we're talking 4,000 to 5,000 people that were allowed to come to the United States. The island of Fayal had a little over 20,000 people at the time. The area that it affected did not affect more than 900 people. So we kind of, said, well, more or less 4,000 to 5,000. So it was a way for us to get a few more people. I mean, I know 4 families that live in the San Joaquin Valley here in California, where I live, that have been here since then. They came as part of the Refugee Act. They were originally from Fayal, but all 4 of them were living in Terceira. So they were not obviously affected directly by the volcano because their families had been living in Terceira prior to the volcano. They didn't move there because of it. They had lived there since the late 40s and early 50s. And so, but because they were from Fayal, they're originally from that area, they petitioned and they came to America. And so it is indeed still, we can paint it any way we want to, but it is a refugee act, and it was a way to help the Azores and help Azoreans find a lifestyle that they didn't have in the archipelago, and of course to help with those who wanted to leave Fayal because of the earthquake. And it's a story of all of the other immigration acts that we've had in the United States, and that is, it's helped people different parts of the world. And we certainly had, we certainly benefited from it, and it did, as you mentioned, it did change the community forever, I believe.
Yeah, the biggest thing that I really want to do this for was because, one, educational, absolutely, but I sometimes see comments on social media, and it's like, and I'm sure everyone has seen it. Oh, these people come here, blah blah blah, and it's like, guys, it's legal immigration through these acts. Being a refugee is legal immigration.
Sure.
Coming to America, and it was just sometimes I feel like I belabor that point to on social media.
Sure, and not every single Portuguese person in the United States or born here, but whose parents or grandparents came, or even great grandparents from the United States, not every single one of them, either them or their forefathers, came legally.
Mhm.
I know at least a dozen families right now, and in the area I live in, that are not here legally.
Sure.
Okay, so when we had the financial crisis and the worldwide recession, of the 2006 to 2010, depends on where it hit different parts of the world. It hit the Azores. This was just 10 years ago. 10, 12 years ago, and it hit the Azores quite hard, as many of your followers will know. And many families, came here on a visiting visa and stayed here. Many of them have been here for 10, 12, 14 years. And they're waiting. We have over 500, according to the Luso American newspaper out of New Jersey. We have over 550 DACA, or we did when they did the story here about almost 2 years ago. And so we also have people who come to America, whether they come legally or illegally, to use that term, they come for a better life. No one came over here to assault the American dream. Everybody just wants to take part in what we call the American dream. And those folks who I know, those dozen families that I know in the San Joaquin Valley, there's more, they live through some uncertain times. They're making the best they can, but they're always very, very scared that, one day they'll, get on a plane and go back to the Azores and never come back. And some of them have roots here. I know a young couple who has two daughters born here, but that, that's not with what we're going on through immigration right now. Even though their two daughters are born here, they're not going to stay here if something happens. So yeah, sometimes, of course, social media is what it is, but I think it's an excellent tool because it tells me a lot about people that I thought I knew, and some people that I thought I didn't know, and I do, vice versa. So it is a way to read people. It's an excellent sociology tool. I mean, if I was a sociologist, I think I would be on social media, 18 hours a day just studying people, because it tells you a lot, especially during this pandemic. People take to it and give opinions. But yeah, the Refugee Act was important. It brought, 4,000 to 5,000 people to the United States, from a group of islands that now has 240,000. At that time, had over 400,000 people. That's still a lot of people, and it kind of refreshed the community because Paul, the thing was, Azoreans have been coming to the New England states and to California, for a very, very long time, since for over 200 years. However, that exodus that we had between the 1860s, 1870s, quite a few people started coming, especially to California, because of the gold rush era, and then all the way up until 1921. And then the first Immigration Act that was put forth in the United States of the 20th century was the 1921 Immigration Act, and that put a different quotas. Up until then, people just came in through Ellis Island, and if you were able to, get a way to come to the United States, you would come here. My grandfather did that in 1910. He came over, and then went back to Portugal in 1928, and a lot of people did that. A lot of people came in the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, and right up until the World War One. And there was lots of immigration from the Azores between, I would say, 1895 and 1915. And lots of people that came over, many of them did go back, like my grandparents. And so when they went back, they took kids who were born in the United States, who were American citizens, okay? Mm-hmm. And so that's why we had, because it was basically the 1921 Immigration Act was so severe to to Portugal. It only allowed, I believe, less than 1,000 people, 900 and some every year. And so it was very, very severe, because it was severe not just to the Portuguese, it was severe to what it called the dark Europeans. Okay, it's in the law. Dark Europeans, and that's the Portuguese, the Spaniards, the Greeks, and the Turks, and the Italians. And so we were the dark Europeans, and so the Southern Europeans, Western Europe, Southwest Europe, and so we were penalized. But people were able to come, not just because of those quotas, and of course not during the wars, and then we had the Depression. But people were able to come, a lot of them in the late 40s and early 50s, before the Azorean Refugee Act, because they were born here. So I had, for example, two aunts that came in the late 50s because they were my mom's sisters that were born here in the United States. My grandfather had 8 daughters, and 5 of them were born. 5 of them were American citizens. And so 2 of them, times were so tough that one of them immigrated the year I was born, 1958, and the other one immigrated 2 years later, 1960. And so they immigrated before the Azorean Refugee Act, or the one in 1958. and they immigrated before the, as you mentioned, the Family Reunification Act. That was the one that really brought an avalanche of people over to the United States from the Azores.
Absolutely. I wrote a little piece about the Azorean Refugee Act and kind of put, my family story out there. And it was ultimately to try and tell people that everybody has a story, right? Everyone has a story, and everyone um, wants what's best for their family at the same time. And well, like you mentioned, on social media, man, you're really seeing people's true colors nowadays on these different platforms. But absolutely, to your point, there was one thing I was curious about, and because I saw it once, maybe on a post or whatever, but I haven't fact checked it yet, and I was curious if you knew. I saw a post once that said there are more Azorean immigrants in America than live in the Azores. Is that true?
I don't know about immigrants, but if you count people who were born here, such as yourself and my children who were born here, so if you count immigrants in first generation, and even if you go into second and third, for sure, definitely. I mean, according to uh, the figures, we'll have hopefully better figures next year after the census of 2020. But the census from 2000 talks about 1.4, 1.5 million Americans who are of Portuguese background. Now we know that the vast majority are from the Azores, so it would be very safe to say, very very safe to say that 750 or at least half of those 750,000 are of Azorean background, 7 to 750. And if that is indeed the case, you're talking about now almost, not double, almost three times the population. And it makes all the sense in the world because, here in California, just in the late 1800s, there were already over 4,000 Portuguese. And so, and most of those were from the Azores, and lots of them stayed here. And lots of them, at that time had large families of 6, 7, 9, 10 kids. And so I believe that there isn't hard data because what is an Azorean? We identify as Portuguese because of the nationality, and so although there was in my theory and many of people's theories, and some great work has been done there in the East Coast, that there is of course this Azorianality or Azorianness. I mean, it's totally different than mainland Portugal. It just shares a language and some cultural concepts as well. However, I don't. There's no hard data, Paul, but for sure. I mean, if we indeed have 1.5 plus million Americans who are of Portuguese background, it's safe to say that close to half of those are from the Azores, identify with the Azores. If you count first, second, and even third generations, in some cases already fourth in California and the East Coast as well, Massachusetts. And so if you do that, yeah, there's definitely twice as many, if not more. I would say immigrants, no, although the Azores lost almost half of its population between the Azorean Refugee Act and the 1980s when immigration kind of ceased from the Azores. So that population went where? Half that population went to the majority of the United States, but quite a few of them also to Canada because there's strong immigration to Canada in the 1960s and 70s, and some to a limited amount to Bermuda. But if we count, and I certainly count first and second generations at least, because people who were born here or even who are the grandchildren of immigrants, they really feel Portuguese and they really feel Azorean. And I think if you count those, certainly there's probably twice, if not three times as many now in the United States. And so I say this in my writings that I do in Portuguese. I don't write in English that much. I should start doing that. Maybe give me a bigger audience. But the my writings that I do in Portuguese, I mention all the time that I don't and it's kind of a take what someone else has said. Um, at one time, a couple of writers have said in the past that they didn't comprehend Portugal without the Azores, and I really don't comprehend the Azores without its diaspora, without its immigration. I think it adds to the Azoreanness having these hundreds of thousands of people that live in Canada and the United States and the thousands in Bermuda as well. So uh, the Azorean diaspora is to me very important for the islands, and Sometimes the islands understand that, sometimes they don't. But I think the new concepts that are being lived by most people, whether it be in academia or even in government or in politics in the Azores, they understand the importance of the diaspora. And it was important, if I may, in 1960s, when you're talking about the Azorean Refugee Act and then the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, or the Family Reunification Act. See, we had an act in 1952 that was the McCarran-Walter Act, and that was an Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1952, but it favored Northern Europe quite a bit, and it created some resentment. It was put forth right at the beginning of the Cold War. So it kind of, distanced itself from Eastern Europe and everything, and a couple other countries, and Asia as well. And so there was lots of resentment from different groups that had been here already about that 1952 Immigration Act, although it was understood, today is understood in the historical concept of the beginning of the Cold War. So that's why in 1965, actually Kennedy started working on it, but then Johnson's the one that signed it, and he signed the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act of 65 at Ellis Island. A very beautiful ceremony. There's lots of pictures, historical pictures about that, and that was what we called in Portuguese as cartas de chamada. I don't know if the term has ever been heard by any folks. Yeah, cartas de chamada, which means letters that are calling you, or it was. Basically what that did, because it was a family reunification act and it opened up a lot more immigration from especially from Asia, and we had quite a few immigrants from Asia here already, especially the Chinese who came here to build our railroad system, dozens and dozens of years before, or hundreds of years before, at least 100 years before that. And what happened was that it allowed, so now we had these folks who had come over in the late, I would say early 50s, and all throughout the 50s. These folks who came over who were born here, who had gone back with their parents when they were children, some of them infants, and who were American citizens from all islands. We have families here in the area I live from here next to Fresno State, actually, that are from Flores, a very strong community from Flores, and most of them, their parents or their grandparents had immigrated, and they were American citizens through their parents or their grandparents. And so these folks came over, especially in the 1950s, and some of them even late 40s, like 48, 49. And then after that, the 4,000 to 5,000 that came after the Family Reunification Act, what did that allow? That allowed, by this time, you have what, 10, 15,000 at least people who had been here had arrived in the last 10 to 15 years before 1965. Many of them had become American citizens, and the ones that didn't applied right away, and they were able to call their families. So they were able to bring their brothers and their sisters and their moms and their dads. I mean, it's a lot of people, for example, one of my aunts brought over my family and my mom's sister and another one, 3 sisters, just in that family. And where there's 5 of them who were born in the United States, the other 3 came over because one of the sisters did that. And that's just not, 3 people between all of us, it was 12 people with kids and everything else. And so times that, I mean, the multiple effect of that, I mean, if you times all these, now 10 to 15,000 people at least would come in the 50s, and then part of, mostly because of the Family Reunification Act, they were able to bring all these other families. And as soon as these families started arriving in 1966, 67, 68, the year we came over, the first thing that a lot of them did, if they were the only ones in their family, in other words, it wasn't, in my dad's case, it wasn't a situation, but he was trying to get his American citizenship papers because he had a sister, okay, and she might want to come over. She decided not to come over, but that's what happened. People would come over. That immigration started in 66 after the Family Reunification Act. And a lot of people that came in that latter part of the 60s and early part of the 70s, one of their major goals was to become American citizens, at the end of the 5-year waiting period, so they could bring more family over. And that's why we had this avalanche, in the late 60s and all throughout the 70s. So these were very, very important. And you asked at the outset, how do they change our community? I mean, we would be the same community in California, and I know it's the same thing in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and throughout the eastern states. as well. In California, over 65% of the organizations that we have were started after 1960. Were started by the posh Capelinhos generation or the posh Family Reunification Act. The Holy Ghost festas here, which are really big, and each community has a hall or an association. Those existed, but for example, the city I'm in, when I came in 1968, um, there were three Portuguese organizations at the time, only three. One of them, the TDS, Solari Divino Espírito Santo, the Holy Ghost Society, existed since the early. That's actually just celebrated 100 years. So since the early parts of the 20th century, the other two that existed were founded. One in 1963 and another one in 1967. So basically because of the Posh Capelinhos. All the Portuguese marching bands in California were founded after that. The folklore groups were a product of that. So we certainly would not be the same community because the community had very little immigration, next to none after 1920, and very little, of course, or no, practically any immigration in 1930s and 40s, and even up to the volcano, up to the Azorean Refugee Act, it had sparse immigrants, only those, as I mentioned, who were born here and had gone back with their parents. So it was like, two families here, three families there. It didn't add up enough to and then the older community that had been here for 100 years, basically, or very close, was becoming a lot more Americanized. Like we already see it now, and we'll see, 40, 50 years from now. Well, one of our major struggles is how do we keep this going?
Absolutely. Do we still see immigration from, let's say Portugal and the Azores still coming to America, or is that kind of plateaued or declined, or do we still see, immigration from these countries coming here?
Well, when we talk about immigration from the Azores, and it kind of actually started to decrease immensely with the revolution of 1974. And it wasn't really the revolution itself; it's what it brought to the Azores. It brought autonomy, our own flag, as you have there,
Yeah.
and so it brought autonomy to the Azores in 1976. The Azores elected their own government, self-governance, statehood for in American terms.
Sure.
And so we were able to keep our taxes, we were able to, spend our money and started a bunch of infrastructure. The beginning of an airport in every single island, ports in various islands and all islands, and some with more than one, obviously. And so the infrastructure started to being built. And then what happened was the immigration decreased because people started to find more opportunities there. With the revolution also came the United States paying for the air base in Terceira. And with that, because prior to that, it was kind of an agreement, and that also brought some funds into to Portugal, and it had repercussions in the Azores as well. So our immigration kind of started to dwindle down in 1978, 79, 80. In 1980, we had the earthquake in Terceira, and I was in Portuguese radio at the time. We had this dark humor that we said, well, because we had kind of already a few immigrant years with low immigration, like 76 to 80. When we saw that, we said, hey, we're going to have new avalanche of immigrants. We're going to have more immigrants because of an earthquake, really horrible humor. But it didn't happen. We had an autonomous government, and the government of Dr. Mota Amaral really took the forefront in this, and people decided to stay and rebuild their homes because they had decent jobs. And so the immigration in the 1980s practically ceased, from the Azores, whether it be the East Coast or California. But it was a high point in immigration to Newark, New Jersey, and to New York, and some points of Connecticut. So from mainland Portugal, the immigration continued throughout the 80s. I have very good friends who immigrated in 1984 and 85, and all the way up until the 90s when it all went down. And now just a few, it takes a long time, because of the process. Some people, I know one family came over about 3 weeks ago, and they told me it took them almost 6.5 years to do all of the different legalities and everything else. And so the few of them that we do have are clandestine or here illegally. But I think if it was simpler, we probably would see a few more because although there are a lot more economic opportunities, but still a tough time in the Azores. A lot of young people, we see that. A lot of young people in the Azores are leaving. They're not coming to America because of what it is, but they're European citizens, so a lot of them go into England. Well, now with Brexit different, but they'll go into France or Germany or Italy or other countries where they can, because they know English well, which is great, and so they can go ahead and function in many other parts of Europe.
Yeah, I think you touched on exactly one of the most, at least I think one of the most important reasons is that you saw it decrease once they had opportunities, though, right? I feel like that's one of the biggest things that,
Sure,
at least immigration in general, right? Everyone just wants
sure.
opportunity. That's all they want is just a chance to succeed.
Sure, sure. There was people talk about the immigration from Mexico. There's a great quote from a great writer from Mexico who once said, "The problem with Mexico, it is too far from God and too close to the United States."
Wow.
And so, it's being a very Catholic country. There's a lot of irony in that, and being close to the U.S. because I've had in my 22 years I spent in high school and now in college a little bit less, but in high school you get to know the kids a lot more because you see them on an everyday basis,
Sure.
and the majority of my kids were Hispanic, and the big percentage were Hispanics who knew how to speak Spanish, so they were immigrants or their parents were immigrants, and most of them missed their country tremendously. The ones who were immigrants, and they just said the only reason we're here is because we can't make a living in our country. When people saying that Mexicans are breaking the door down to come to the United States, well, yeah, because of the opportunity. It isn't because they don't love their country. We all love our country, and I would venture to say, if the Azores were not 4-hour flight away, if it was like driving from California to Mexico, from where I live in the Central Valley, it's 6 hours. If we were a 6-hour ride from Massachusetts to Ponta Delgada, I don't know how many more people would have from San Miguel and all of the other islands, coming, whether it be legal or illegal, on a 6-hour ride over to Massachusetts.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, there was one thing I wanted to ask you, and it's a bit off topic, a bit not. When we're talking about Azorian and the identity and understanding immigration with it, there was one thing I always found interesting, and I don't know if there's a word for this, and if there is, maybe you know. It's you almost, for instance, we talk about Spanglish, right? These words that Hispanic will come in and they kind of, for instance, my example is over here. Sometimes I know, generally speaking, Azorian immigrants, when we talk about a store, right? They'll say, "Oh, I'm going to the store." They say
Mhm.
that, or the basket. And what was so interesting to me, Professor Borges, when I went to the Azores, I visited St. Michael. Um, I was hearing those words being said on the island. And I was with my family. I go, that's not a real word. And they go, what do you mean? I go, it's a loja. That's the word. And but it was amazing. And I don't know if there's a real word to describe words like that. But I just found it so interesting when I went to the Azores. They were actually used, and it made sense to me because I was thinking, all right, if you immigrated to the U.S. but you visit your homeland again, maybe you're incorporating these words and it just catches or something.
Well, yeah, it's called Port English in Portuguese. We call it Port English, like Spanglish. So Port English. There's a few studies done in the East Coast. Here in California, Dr. Eduardo Mayon Diaz, professor emeritus from UCLA. Dr. Diaz is very ill, unfortunately. He's in his 90s, and but did a wonderful job collecting these words. My good friend Lucia Noya, who is still alive and very well, and Lucia owns a chain of homes, social service homes, for the severely handicapped. But when Lucia was doing her master's, she did a study on them as well. She's been collecting them. There are over 1,000 of them that between both of them have, and some of them are loosely done, but Stoa is of course the most famous one. Gas
Sure,
station.
sure, sure.
There's lots of them. There's lots of Closet is one of my favorite ones.
Gazeta, basket,
Yeah, yes, those are all those are all some of my favorite. But there is, and I think they're a rich part. I don't know if you guys use there in the East Coast. We use the word refrigerator,
oh, yeah, yeah,
and we also use frigidata.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, it was frigideira is a sertão. It's a frying pan in Portuguese, but we use in the Azores we use the word sertão more than we use frigideira. And the interesting thing about frigideira here in California, according to Dr. Diaz, it's because in the 1960s, early 1960s, the major brand was Frigidaire, and they had this big old thing outside of it. And if you look at Frigidaire, it's Frigideira, reading it with the Portuguese
Sure.
tonality. So it's a way for people to adapt. We didn't know in the 1960s in the Azores what a loja was. We didn't have. We had a venda, the little place that sold, things. You went to buy, a few grams of sugar or half a kilo of this or that. And so the people were adopting that. I mean, people in the 1960s in the Azores didn't have. That's why people say a lot of times un telephone, with an American tonality to it. So I think they're rich. They were very ridiculed by Portugal, unfortunately, and that's too bad because now they use everything from. It's chic in Portugal to say when you go to a hotel and you say hello, bom dia, and they say o senhor está aqui para fazer o check-in. Well, okay, yeah, I'm here to check in. And so now a lot of Portuguese words are used, especially those that do with technology. Um, they're all English words. At that time, when Portuguese people used to go back in the 1970s, we went back in 1972, and my dad tried his best never to use a Portuguese word because he didn't want to be ridiculed. But one time he used, someone said something to him and he said, "Oh, sure, sure, sure," which means sure, of course, sure, but we say sure, well, sure. And he was ridiculed and he slapped his hand, a couple of times. He himself, I'm never going to use that word again. But he was used to using it here, although we had only been here 4.5 years. But all of the people he would see at festas, at Portuguese events, at clubs, visiting families, they all use those words interchangeably. I mean, my mom still uses them. She has never said frigorífico ever since she's been in America. She still says she's 86 years old, and she still says refrigerator, and I understand it perfectly. And so I think they're rich. They're
Absolutely.
a way for people to adapt to a new country, and it showed our sense of being able to adapt and to fit in. That's one that has positives and negative connotations. The positive is we fit in, we've been successful. I mean, not everybody's a millionaire, obviously. I certainly didn't make it, but everybody, is trying their best they can. They bought their home and they're trying to live the American dream somewhat. However, sometimes we lose, part of our heritage, our history, and that is one thing, Paul. I applaud you for doing this because, and having these conversations, because one of my major concerns in California, and I cannot speak for the East Coast, my major concern in California is that the young Portuguese Americans of your generation and younger, in California anyway, do not know their history. And I'm not just talking about the history of all the kings of Portugal or the history of the Salazar regime, which is important to know all of it, but the history of the community itself, how we have been able to, that's why we're doing this project with the Portuguese radio in California, 100 years. I mean, it's amazing that Portuguese radio started in California 4 years before it started in Portugal. And so the very first time a radio station spoke Portuguese in the world was in California in 1920 with a guy by the name of José Vitorino from the island of Terceira who was illiterate, did not know how to read or write, but knew how to talk and did a radio program in Portuguese. That's part of who we are. And I think as a community, we need to do a lot more of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I also wanted to tell our viewers, if you have a chance, I believe the video is still up that you did a live interview or it was posted. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but you guys talked about that and how news was retrieved. I really found fascinating because that was something I was like, I had never thought of that. Like, yeah, how was news retrieved back then? And you guys cover a lot of that. So it was fascinating.
We're going to continue doing that because Portuguese radio programs were very important for California and also for the East Coast. But we have a bigger tradition out here. I think maybe because there was a lot of rural areas and the radio stations it was cheaper to buy an hour. In 1977, I bought an hour. It was $50 a week, was $200 a month. Okay. And then I commercialized it. I had about, $350, $375 with an ad. So I made $150 a month. It was a way to supplement my income, and it was a way to serve the community. So they have a very, very important role. But whether it be with radio, or whether it be with the press, or whether it be with just our family histories, as you mentioned, with the Port English words, I think that we as a community do a better job to inform our young people that things didn't just come, from the sky, and all of this was constructed by our forefathers.
Oh, absolutely. And I think for me, I definitely see the same thing that you're mentioning on the East Coast. I mean, here, one of the biggest things I see that always upset me, and I've worked with this issue here and where I live in Attleboro, is the fashion of speech songs. We're seeing that almost disappear in a lot of our communities here in the East Coast. Whether it be the younger generation just isn't getting involved in that. And, it hurt me because I always tell people, know where you come from and be proud of that, right? Or at least have an understanding of it, because those traditions mean a lot to one. It should mean a lot to the younger generation, but it means a lot to that older generation too, because that was something they brought here, and it's something that they're passionate about and have a lot of pride in. So I definitely echo what you're saying as well, because we do see that here on the East Coast.
And what you were mentioning about words back and forth, that's why this immigration and that's why the diaspora is so important to the Azores. And because those words that you mentioned when you went back, and it was kind of crazy to hear them,
Sure.
that people would actually use them. They use them. I have my cousins who say freezer. They don't say,
Sure, sure.
congelador or whatever. They say freezer, and it's because my aunts used to use it. They went back from the states there. They went back to Terceira, and they use the word, and some of my cousins use it all the time. The whole festas, the idea of queens is nothing that we didn't have in the Azores. Pico now does queens, and a couple of other islands are doing queens of not the queens of their big, festas do Conselho. I'm talking about the queens of the festas do Espírito Santo, and it's something that started in California, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. And so the idea of the queen of the festas that all Portuguese festas in California have, they actually have two, the senior queen and the junior queen. It is an idea that now is being taken up by the Azores, because that's what culture does. It's never static, so and who's to say that, the Azores are the ones that are doing it right? Well, no, we've created our own here. I think in order for culture to survive, in order for the Portuguese culture to survive, and the Azoreanness of the culture to survive in the U.S., it needs to create its own roots.
Absolutely. I have two. I know we're probably running a little later, but I have a few. One more question, just one more word that popped up. Appuntamento was a big one that I always heard when you're calling a doctor. What are you doing? Oh, I have to schedule appuntamento, right? And I'm like, well, we can say appointment. Like, they know what I'm talking about. They know what it is. I was like, all right. But there was another thing I was wondering if I could just get your take on. It's something that I find fascinating about the Azores, and that is pronunciations, right? Because it varies island to island, and even from a freguesia to freguesia, village to village, that I found. I can't speak to Terceira. I don't know if it's from village to village because I've never been, but from St. Michael, I mean, my family's from Covoada, which is completely different from, Vila de Franco or Hop Peixe. They all have their different accents. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about or comment your thoughts on how the accents just vary, and just maybe just speak a little bit about those, because I find that fascinating. I think.
Yeah, I find them fascinating as well, and there is different accents in Terceira too. But believe it or not just in São Miguel. São Miguel has, of course, right now half of the population of the Azores, over half actually, and so it is probably the widely known. I mean, I'll just tell you, this is a little anecdotal situation. I was in mainland Portugal for a conference before this whole thing happened, but actually it was last year. And this has had happened to me before, but I was there. This was the reason I'm mentioning last year, because it's just so new.
Sure.
And I was talking to a couple of people, and they were talking to me, and I was they asked me where I was from, and I said, well, I live in the United States, but I'm originally from the Azores. He said, the Azores, and I said, yeah. And they said, he said, you don't sound like an Azorean. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, you don't have that different pronunciation that the Azoreans have. And they're talking about San Miguel accent, which has a little more close pronunciation. So to them, to some of these people, everybody in the Azores speaks the same way. No,
Sure.
not everybody in the Azores, there's been there have been studies done. Probably a few more should be, but it has to be where the island was located, who went to the island in the original sense of it, where they came from. And then, of course, right now we think, oh, well, it's an archipelago. They're so close to each other, but not really. Not real. First of all, up until every island had a port and an airport, the Azores really didn't know each other. And so people from Terceira did not know people from San Miguel. People from San Miguel always had a closer bond, probably with Santa Maria, because they're in the same, group. But the only two islands that had a little bit more communication between each other was Pico and Fayal, because they're half-hour boat ride, and people from Pico used to go sell their vegetables in Fayal, and vice versa. And so there was lots of trade between those two islands. But between the other islands, very, very little. And so uh, we were kind of so we developed our own pronunciations, okay, throughout the time, and it changes also in Terceira itself. They say that people in Terceira, when they talk, they sing a little bit. There's a little bit of a song to it, But there are some freguesias that are even worse. They say ah, it's like they're and so it's fascinating because they're so close to each other. I mean, my gosh, you're talking about, 7-minute car ride or whatever. But for centuries, they were, even in their own island, I don't know how many people from Vila Franca would go to Nordeste.
Sure.
They still don't, a lot. But I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
can you imagine 75, 80, 100 years ago?
yeah.
My grandfather lived in Terceira all of his life until he died at 78. He lived 18 years in the United States. So he lived in Terceira 60 of those years, the first 19 years of his life, and then after that. Um, and he was from Praia da Vitória, or Cabo da Praia, which is a freguesia parish next to Praia da Vitória. And my grandfather went to Angra 6 times in his life, 6 times. And two of those because when he came over, he had to do a lot of documentation and paperwork. So, I mean, we were close to Praia, so there were some services there. But on my father's side, I don't think my paternal grandfather, who lived all of his life, never left for immigration there, I don't think he went to Angra maybe more than 5 or 6 times in his whole 77 years that he lived. So, and how many times did he go to those who know the geography of Terceira, for example, how many times did he go from Praia to, for example, Raminho or Altares? I mean, people would go to bullfights, but they would go to bullfights on their own area or their own freguesias or the freguesia next to it. But they weren't traveling in a horse, or walking, hours in order to go to a bullfight. That didn't happen. Now that's why all of the different festivals are celebrated more universally. Let's put it that way throughout the island because people get in the car and it's always. But even today they still have that mentality. I was just in Terceira the beginning of the year, and I had some family there, and I had some cousins, and we were going to go to lunch, and I said, "You guys are my guests. Let's go to." Where do you want to go have lunch? I said, let's go have at this place. And I named the restaurant. And she said, that's in Praia. And they're in Mangra. And I said, yeah. She goes, oh, that's a long way. Well, it's 22 minutes, it's
Yeah.
22 minutes, but oh, that's a long way. Because of course, in America, things are close. And in California is even worse. I mean, even people from the East Coast laugh at us because we say, sometimes I'll say to people, well, it's not that far, they just live in Turlock. Well, how far is it from your area to Turlock? Oh, 2.5 hours. So, California is a different world itself. It's
Sure.
somebody who lives 2.5 hours from us is kind of a neighbor. And so that's basically the reason. So Azoreans did not know themselves very well. And this concept of Azoreanness between the Mezi, of course, developed it, but it's I think only taken shape after 1976. And because of two things, the isolation between islands. In 1963, there was an earthquake in São Jorge, and some kids came from São Jorge, or some families came from São Jorge to Terceira. They actually gave or allowed people to live in homes that were abandoned by immigrants. And there was some families that came to the area where I lived. And I'll never forget this. My grandmother used to love to sit in her patio outside and gossip with all of her lady friends. There were two or three of them, and they would get together in one of the four different patios to talk through the afternoon. And one day they were all there, and these kids were there, and I was playing with my cousins. And these kids came over, and one of my grandmother's best friends said, "Diniz, don't go play with those kids. They're from Saint George. We have no idea how they are."
Wow.
I mean, it was like they were from Mars, you know what I'm saying? And my grandmother's the one that kind of slapped her a little bit and said, "We're all Portuguese, we're all whatever." She was
Yeah.
a very open-minded person. But, and Dona Terezinha, as her name was, did not do that as in a bad sense. It
Sure.
was just Azores didn't know each other. And today, the thing is with mainland Portugal and the Azores. I just told this to a group not too long ago. I was in the 2 years ago, I was in Lisbon going to a conference in the Azores in Graciosa, and there was an issue with the plane, and we didn't leave Newark, New Jersey until later, and so I missed a lot of the flights. And I was talking to the lady, the young lady at the counter at TAP, and she told me, she said, "Now you're going to but your final destination is not Terceira." And I said, "No, my final destination is Graciosa." She goes, "Where the hell is that?"
Wow. That's
Okay.
surprising to me. Wow.
So yeah, she was like maybe 27 years old, 28, and this was only a couple of years ago. Where the hell's that at? And so sometimes even that I don't. All Azorians know all the islands now, and this may be sound strange for some folks, but I think that the Azorians always had a better knowledge of mainland Portugal. We had to learn in the fourth grade all of the railroads that we had never seen a train in our lives because there wasn't one in the Azores. And I get people from mainland Portugal ask me. I had someone ask me not too long ago, "How do you go from island to island?" And my answer is always this one, which some people look at me funny, and then of course but I've had a friend of mine just tell me, "I never thought of that." I said, "Oh, we can walk on water. It's a gift that we got."
Yeah, yeah. That's too funny. No, it's amazing, and I've seen videos online um, of I wish I remembered. I'll send it to you once I find it. But it was this gentleman who takes each island and he does their accent,
Yeah.
if you will, or how they.
Good friend of mine, Vitor Ruidores, from the
Yes.
island of originally from Graciosa, but lives in Fayal. He's actually a teacher. And Horta, a good actor, a very good actor, a good poet, and writes also wonderful lyrics for songs. And yeah, Vitor's. I mean, there's lots of people doing him in the Azores, but I think Victor's the best. Yeah,
Yeah, because there was
Vitor Ruidores. Yeah,
and
he's
the
the
thing is,
best.
like, I love it because I see how, because my mother's from San Miguel and my father's from Terceira, and but he explained it the best, and how I understood it was he kind of said, Saint Michael they end low, Terceira they would end high,
Right. Yeah.
like depois tá em casa,
Yeah.
depois tá em casa,
Yeah,
and it was I
yeah.
was
We
like,
open up, and
yeah, it was
it's a totally
amazing.
different concept. So you're kind of the United Nations of the Azores. It's your home.
I tried.
Yeah, with someone from Terceira and San Miguel, the two most rival islands.
Yeah, well, it's amazing because I used to always do the impersonation of, the Terceira with my father, and because I said, I go, how does it sound? And it's exaggerated, right? How we'll do it as a joke, but then he was FaceTiming uh, his brother, my uncle, on the Facebook video, and the first thing he says, and it's he answers it, and it's just my uncle goes, "Opa, já viste o dia foi hoje?" And he turns, and he's showing, like, the beautiful weather, and I just couldn't. I had to walk away. I just couldn't stop laughing. I was like, "It's exactly it. It's exactly what it was." Because that was my first time
Sure,
actually hearing it in person.
sure. With education levels in the Azores changing, especially in the last, since the revolution, but I would say in the last 30 years, unfortunately, we still have dilemmas, with lots of people, a bigger percentage than should be, abandoning high school. But that's changing. And with the education levels changing, with more communication between island to island, it may be a thing of the past in 50 or 100 years,
Sure.
that the islands may sound a lot more the same than they did before. The very closed pronunciation of San Miguel, I don't hear it anymore. especially in Ponta Delgado. I mean, you hardly ever hear that very close San Miguel accent that I saw when we first went to San Miguel in 1968, and were there for almost a little over a week because of getting our visa. And my godfather, who married and lives in Terceira, was from San Miguel, so I was raised with the Michelense accent. However, the thing is that I think that with education levels, unfortunately, some of the pronunciations are going to change. But as you said, it doesn't. It does. When I go to some of the freguesias in Terceira, I still hear some of the old ways of pronouncing the words, and I think that that's lovely, because I think that people should pronounce it, the way that it's part of who they are in that island. But it has changed. It has changed. It has changed. I mean, where everyone had that same kind of pronunciation, probably, when I was being raised. My cousins, if you listen to my cousins, of course, some of them have lived outside the island, so you would know that they're from Terceira. They sound more like somebody from other islands. And there's a definite pronunciation. São Jorge has a lovely pronunciation when they say the R's. I love the São Jorge because of the R's. Pashora, and I think that that's just lovely because but there is the very few people speak like that in São Jorge any longer. Actually, the immigrants here in my part of the woods from São Jorge speak like I don't hear it in São Jorge any longer. The older way. So it's all changing.
Yeah, like you said, I think when you say kind of that Portuguese English, it's that rich. I feel the same way with the different accents throughout the Azores and throughout the world, because I think that's what makes us
Sure.
who we are, and we shouldn't, we should be proud of that. But anyway,
Sure.
Mr. Borges, I want to thank you again, because we
Thanks so
probably
much.
we read a little bit more than I had a feeling this was going to happen too, but I was
Quite a
like,
bit more, I should say.
so thank you again, and I will. If there's did you want to add anything before we go? Is there anything you want to make sure maybe the Portuguese community, for my following or out there, if there's a message you want to send to them, if there's anything else you want
No, I think that I share your concerns, and I think that we should all, regardless of our politics, the problem is polarization in America has unfortunately also hit our community, and everybody looks at things like refugees and in every kind of issue. Everybody looks at it with a political lens, and I wish we would just take those political glasses off and look at it, from a humanistic point, whether it be the situation with Black Lives Matter or the situation with immigration. We've all been there. Portugal, in the case of Black Lives Matter, Portugal has a horrible history with slavery and everything. We can't, and as I put it just recently with my colleagues from the California Portuguese American Coalition, the CPAC statement, we can't change the past, but we can certainly shape the future. And so I think the future of the community, we have to have these conversations here in California. We're going to start some forums. And I think then you also need to go nationwide. And I think we need to have some conversations about who we are. You said social media, and just not too long ago, I had a young man in his late 30s, or I should say early 40s now, and whose father was a good friend of mine, passed away. And when he said, and he made a pretty racist statement, and he said, because my family has been here a long time. Well, his father immigrated when he was 15. He would be 70 if he was alive. So, his family's been here 55 years. And I responded to him. I don't pick fights on social media, but I did respond to him on a private message. And I said, listen, the people that you're talking about have been here 400 years. And so, when you say we've been here a long time, no, we haven't. The difference is Europeans came with their nice clothes, and most of them leaving because they wanted to where Africans came without clothes and in chains. So this is the history of who we are as a country, and we cannot go back and change that. But we certainly need to have a dialogue, and I think it's important that the Portuguese Americans have this dialogue as well. And this dialogue for us has a double meaning. We have to look at the country, at the history of this country, and face it as it is. But we also have to look at the history of our forefathers and face it as it is. Portugal has done a really good job in facing its reality and moving forward, and its past and moving forward. And I think the Portuguese American communities do so as well. So anything that you are putting forth there in the East Coast, I'd like to see more of this. I know these are hard conversations, not the one we had today, but these are hard conversations to have about race and discrimination in the Portuguese American community. But we must have them if we're going to move forward as a community in the United States of America. We can't just put, we can't say, we can't be complicit. Silence is complicity, as it's been said by many people,
Sure.
including Dr. Martin Luther King, in more eloquent ways as I could ever put. But not only just complicity, I don't think we need to be silenced. Even, let me put it from an egotistical standpoint, even for our own perspective. I don't think we can be silenced for others, obviously, but I don't think we can be silenced because of us, because of our future, for our kids and for our grandkids, for future generations. This is the America that we all have fought hard and have worked hard for. And I think that these issues have to be faced in our own community so we can move forward. So thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you again. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining me for some of these interviews. I'm going to try and put more interviews out there regarding the, kind of these tough, well, again, this was just an educational one, but I am have stuff planned for those tough conversations, as we mentioned. So again, Professor Borges, thank you again. I know we ran over. Sometimes I can't shut up even when I want to. So thank you.
This is as much of my fault as yours. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So thank you again, Professor Borges.
Thank you. Take care.